All right, well, good evening, everyone, for the last of the series on early Anabaptist history, or the history of the early believer baptizers. I still haven't come up with a name that fits these people, but, it's interesting. I was reading an account, an interrogation of an early Anabaptist leader. And they asked him, well, when were you, the Catholics asked him, when were you rebaptized? And he said, we were not rebaptized. We were baptized upon confession of our faith with true baptism. And so they wouldn't even say, they wouldn't even say they were rebaptized. So again, I think the term Anabaptist is still problematic. Okay, this evening, the Martyr's Mirror, the unity of martyrdom. And we've looked at various kinds of Anabaptists in this series, looked at its beginnings in Switzerland, the spread, the various influences that impacted various forms of Anabaptism, whether it's in Switzerland, whether it's in Moravia, the Hutterites. We even looked at the Munsterites. And of course, we looked at Dutch Anabaptism and the later development of the Swiss Brethren and so on. And one of the things that we have to remember is that Anabaptism was never a monolithic movement. That means it was not just one kind of movement where everything was exactly the same. There was no Pope. There was no Martin Luther. There wasn't any John Calvin, who kind of were the persons who set the parameters of their particular churches and so on. And so from the very beginning, it was a grassroots movement that had some variety to it. It was decentralized in many ways. Now, in the Netherlands, it became more centralized as the role of bishops or elders evolved and so on. But that was, and among the Hutterites, you have the development of a chief elder who's in charge of the whole, over all the Bruderhaus and so on. But for the most part, it's a very decentralized, congregational, local structure with connections, with connectedness, okay, in which there was cooperation, working together, recognizing each other as brethren. So thinking about all that variety and so on, you kind of can get this feeling, well, it certainly was a bit of a scattered thing. But this evening I want to look at the Martyr's Mirror, which, and the theme is the unity of martyrdom. Okay? And of course, the Martyr's Mirror was edited, compiled by Tilman van Braal, a Dutch Mennonite minister at Dordrecht. And he lived, he wasn't quite 40 years old when he died. I think it's around 64, 66. I should have looked it up before I came this evening. He died, but he was very prolific, very learned. He read Latin, and he read German, and of course his native Dutch, and so on, probably French. So he was quite adept, and he also was a very able debater. There is a debate that he had with a Reform minister, the record of which, the transcript of the debate is still exists, and he came out quite well in that debate. And this was a tremendous task. Over here on the table, I have two copies of the Martyr's Mirror, a 1685 Dutch Martyr's Mirror, the second edition, and then the 1748-49 German Martyr's Mirror printed at Ephrata. And as you can see, they're massive books. They're large books. Okay? And how did he get it done? All right? Well, the thing we have to keep in mind is that the Martyr's Mirror was a book that grew. It grew from small beginnings into that big book that you see over there. Now, but I want us, first of all, to think about what Tilman van Braal is doing. And we can see it in the title of the Martyr's Mirror. That's the title page of the 1660, the first edition of the Martyr's Mirror. And the title is The Bloody Theater of the Baptism-Minded and Defenseless Christians, who for the testimony of Jesus their Savior have suffered and been slain from the time of Christ to our last time. Also a description of holy baptism and other aspects of service to God practiced through all times, included in 2 books, being an enlargement of the previous Martyr's Mirror from many faithful chronicles, memorials, and testimonies by TJVB, that's Tilman Jans van Bra, printed in Dordrecht by Jacob Brott in the year 1660. Now, the title is important, okay, because there were many martyr books. The Calvinists had 2 or 3 martyr books. The English had a martyr's book, what we commonly refer to as Fox's Book of Martyrs, but its original title was Acts and Monuments, okay? And the Roman Catholics had martyr books, okay? They all had martyr books. But Tilman van Bra, when he was looking at his martyr, when he was working on his martyr book, there's 2 kinds of people that he's looking for. He's looking for baptism-minded and defenseless Christians. And the term baptism-minded in the Dutch is doopgezinde, and that is still what the Dutch Mennonites refer to themselves as. Doopgezinde literally translates as baptism-minded. So they actually have a name they can call themselves without having to use Anabaptist and so on. Baptism-minded is a little awkward in English, but in German, Taufgesinnt, which is sometimes used, okay? But it never quite got transferred into English, so we're stuck with this term Anabaptist. But the 2 criteria for inclusion in Tilman van Bra's Martyr's Mirror is, do they baptize upon confession of faith? Do they practice believer's baptism? And are they defenseless? Okay? Are they non-resistant? Okay, so those are the 2 categories. And that's also, and that excludes a lot of people. Okay, excludes the Reformed, the Calvinist, the Lutheran. There's also was a Lutheran martyrology. It excludes those people. Okay? But interesting enough, it includes everyone who falls under follows under those 2 criteria. And so whether you're Swiss Brethren, whether you're Dutch Mennonite, whether you're Hutterite, all those persons are here in the Martyr's Mirror, are represented in the Martyr's Mirror. In the first books too, yeah, but some of that's a little sketchy. I'll talk about that here in a bit. Now, how did it start out? As I said, it didn't just all of a sudden. It actually had small beginnings. Almost immediately, as Anabaptism grew and spread and so on, there are martyrs. There are people being killed. Of course, Felix Manz is the second martyr killed in Zurich in 1527. There was an earlier one killed in St. Gallen. No, not St. Gallen. In Schwartz, I think, in 1526. But one of the things that, and of course remember this is the printing press, and the most popular type of literature were broadsides and little pamphlets. And here we have examples of title pages of 2 pamphlets. One is an account in about Waniken Klaasdacher, 1527. She's in the Netherlands at a place called Monniken. And she's apprehended. Now, it's interesting is that her story is told in the first collection of Anabaptist martyr stories, the Het Ochten de Heeren, which we'll look at here in a bit. But she was not an Anabaptist. She was what they refer to as a sacramentarian. Anabaptism hadn't actually made its way up to the Netherlands by 1527, but she's a sacramentarian. She doesn't believe the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation, there were these little groups there in the Netherlands who they were underground and so on, but they refused to acknowledge that. And she's captured, she's questioned, and she is executed. Now, in the Martyr's Mirror, which continues this account that goes back to 1562, and head off into Heron, the interrogators ask her, they go through, what do you think of the sacrament, asking about transubstantiation. They said she doesn't serve a bread God. And then they asked her, what do you think of the oil for anointing, for extreme unction? He said, oil is good for salad or for putting on your shoes. I would say she's a little provocative. And of course, they burnt her at the stake. But her story was very, very quickly written down in a ballad form, in a poetic form, and printed and disseminated. And this is a title page of that pamphlet. Similar to that, in 1545, we'll talk a little bit more about them later on, are two women, Maria and Ursula van Bectum. They are sister-in-laws, and they are captured, they are interrogated, and executed. Interesting enough, Maria, who was married to a Jan van Bectum, her husband remained Roman Catholic, but she was able to actually, her brother remained Roman Catholic, but she was able to, Ursula was her sister-in-law and married to her brother. And he remained Roman Catholic, but these two women became Anabaptists. So you have these little pamphlets circulating around for instructional purposes, to edify, to encourage people to faithfulness. Okay? And then in 1562, a believer compiled the first edition of the Het Offenen de Heeren, the Sacrifice to the Lord. And this is a small book, has about 25 stories in it. Interesting, it starts out, the first story is about Stephen from the Bible. The second story is about Michael Sattler. And all the other stories then, all the other accounts have to do with martyrs in the Netherlands. Okay, and of course this is produced in the Netherlands, all right? And this was printed in 1562. And you see, there's a title page, and then there's a last page, which has the table of contents in it. Now today, normally when we make a book, we put the table of contents in the front. Back then, the table of contents often was back in the back. So back in the back on the last page, it says, printed in the year 1562. It doesn't say who the printer was. And that's very common, because if they were caught doing this, they could be executed. Okay? Now, there are 10 later editions of the Het Offenen de Heeren between 1562 and 1599. And this is another edition from 1578. And I have a ruler there underneath just to show you how small this book is. It's not a big book. It can very easily fit in your pocket or in your coat and so on, which is probably good. You didn't want people to see you carrying around this great big book. So this is a very small book of these stories. And in the preface of the Het Offenen de Heeren, it says, and this gets to the purpose of, this is actually the title of the book. This book has been named The Sacrifice of the Lord because its contents pertain to some sacrificed children of God who brought forth from the good treasure of their hearts confessions, letters, and testimonies which they spoke with their mouths and have sealed with their blood, for the comfort and strengthening of the slaughtered sheep of Christ, who were ordained to death to the praise, glory, and honor of him who created all things, whose power endures from eternity to eternity. Amen. That's the title. People don't write titles like that anymore. Okay? That's the title of the Het Offenen de Heeren. Now, looking then at the preface, this tells us why this collection of martyr stories and also letters, a lot of letters written by the martyrs, oftentimes while they were in prison, okay, and then somehow or another smuggled out. Now, further, beloved reader, let the most merciful God and Father, by his boundless grace and loving kindness in these last dangerous times, have portrayed to some, to the eyes of their conscience, his blessed, only, and eternal Son, Jesus Christ, who so many hundreds of years has been unknown, and some who lay ruin in all sins and ungodliness, he is awakened and called into a new blameless life, and has given them into the hand and keeping of their only and eternal shepherd, Jesus Christ, who has received, cleansed, and purchased them with his red and precious blood for a free possession. So all the gates of hell assemble now against all those who are sprinkled with the blood of the Lamb. The poor, blameless, peaceful, defenseless little lamb is through the serpent's envy against his chosen members hated, persecuted, and killed with the sword, water, and fire. So we thought it good, dear reader, to collect testimonies, letters, and testaments left behind by some sacrificed children of God for the comforting and strengthening of all lovers of the truth. This makes a person observe and understand how mightily God still works in his chosen ones and comforts and strengthens and supports them in their need, just as we also find abundantly in many examples from the Old and the New Testament. Therefore, beloved reader, fear your God with your whole heart and your entire soul. Seek him with all your strength. Watch night and day. Knock at the throne of his grace, that he might hold you with his fatherly hands in all woe, and graciously stand by you in all trouble and need, and truly preserve you in his way, word, and truth, in order that your foot might not stumble on a stone, and likewise in your belief, testimony, and life, you may not fall, be broken, and come to disgrace, but that you might keep your entrusted treasure free and pure until that day, and likewise with all the saints attain the promised land, inheritance, kingdom, life, and crown. Okay? So what's the purpose? What was the purpose of this small little book? It was first of all, we have to keep in mind, this is a period of time in which they're still being persecuted. In fact, the persecution is going to continue on for at least 3 more decades in many parts of Europe. But the purpose of it is to demonstrate to believers, those who have suffered for their faith and been true and faithful, and with the encouragement that if you're apprehended, if you're captured, if you're put in prison, if you're scourged, if you're pulled on the rack, you're tortured, and finally you're executed, just like these martyrs, you can be faithful to the end. That's the purpose of it. So this is a collection that is compiled to encourage people to be willing to, if it so happens, to face martyrdom. Okay? Now, along with that, in 1563, a year later, a songbook, okay, a Leitboken, with 25 martyr ballads was compiled. Now, these are, again, these are very much like the 2 things we looked at before with Wyneken Klaus Doctor and Maria and Ursula van Beckum. These are accounts that are written in poetic form, and I guess were meant to be sung, but they tell stories. And it was printed a year after the first edition of the Het Offen de Heeren, but then afterwards it was often printed along, and subsequent editions was often printed alongside of it. It's a songbook celebrating the sacrifice of the Lord, in which old and new songs, various copies are gathered in order to become faithful to the sacrifice, because it touches similar matters as the betrayal, capture, and death of the slaughtered sheep of Christ, who faithfully obeyed the voice of their shepherd, Jesus Christ, even unto death. Now, one of the things I should mention is that almost all the accounts in the Het Offen de Heeren and in the songbook are included in the Martyr's Mirror. Now, what the Martyr's Mirror does is it kind of converted these poetic hymns into prose. Okay, but the stories are still there. So these, like I said, this is a small book, about 25 hymns. About 25 accounts, about 25 hymns. It's not very big. But in 1615, we had the first of the big martyr books. History of the Martyrs are the true witness of Jesus Christ, who since the year 1524 has also fought for the gospel truth in many turmoils, confirmed it with their blood, with their confessions, disputations, and the writings of their living hope, powerful faith, and burning love to God in the same holy truth. Now, this is 1615, okay? In the Netherlands, okay, in the northern part of the Netherlands, what we call now Netherlands, but not Belgium, because that was considered to be part of the Netherlands back then too. The believers had been granted toleration. William the Silent, the Prince of Orange, who became the ruler of the northern part of the Netherlands, granted them toleration in the 1570s. But martyrdom and persecution is still there in the memory of the older generation. Okay, it's still there in the memory of the older generation. And it had continued on, okay, it continued on in the southern part of the Netherlands, had continued on in other parts of Europe, though the last martyr, the last Anabaptist to be martyred was Hans Landis in 1614. Okay, but this collects a lot of stories. Okay, it includes the stories that are in Het Offen de Heeren and in the songbook and so on. But it also, all right, what's going on? Oh, there we are. Let's go back. Okay. All right, here. Okay. All right. There we are. But this was compiled by two Dutch Mennonite or Doopgezinde leaders, Jacob Otterman and Hans de Ries. And it was interesting because they actually sent somebody down into Moravia or somewhere and got a copy of the Hutterite Chronicle. And so this 1615 Martyrs book has stories of martyrs taken right from the Hutterite Chronicle. And in fact, that copy of the Hutterite Chronicle still exists in Amsterdam. It's in the library of the University of Amsterdam in the Mennonite collection there. Okay, so they're pulling stories from this. So there's stories of martyrs in Switzerland, in Moravia, and Austria, and so on. The other thing that's really interesting is that they're also stories and accounts and what they call admonitions. The Martyr's Mirror refers to as admonitions or exhortations that are lifted out of the Ospund. Okay, the first Ospund came out in 1564. The more complete edition came out in 1583, and they apparently had a copy of this 1583 Ospund because they lifted accounts and so on right out of that. And so those are two sources that expand the scope of martyrs that are being included. And then in the meantime, all right, okay, let me see if I use this. Does that work better? Oh, there we are. Okay, I just need to use this thing here. In the meantime, there are other pamphlets and booklets that are being printed because there are more martyrs happening after after the Het Offen de Heeren is collected. Thomas van Imbroik is a very famous martyr. In fact, there's an account of him in his confession was as an appendix in the Ospund, was added to the Ospund later on. Okay, but his confession was printed as a little book all of its own, and had an account of his martyrdom. Jacob de Roer, sometimes known as Jacob the Candlemaker, while he was in prison in the Netherlands, I mean in what's now Belgium and Flanders, he wrote letters to people, and those letters were collected and they were printed in 1577. He was executed in 1569. Similar, Jan Wurtsensoen van Kuijk, his letters and testimonies in 1579. And these persons are all in the Martyr's Mirror. Now, Jacob de Roer wrote, there's 19 letters in this little booklet, and there's about 7 or 8 letters that were lifted from that and included in the Martyr's Mirror. So, 1615, there's this first of these big martyr books. 1617, Peter Jan Twisk and Sivits Petersons compile they basically take the 1615 Martyr's Mirror and add an appendix to it and include about 100 more martyrs in this appendix. So the thing is growing. And then here's the first oops, let's go back here. This thing is being contemptible, as my mother would say. This is the beginning of the appendix. And so you have to, it just basically reprints the 1615 and then adds some more stories. Okay? And then in 1626, there's another account, another martyr book, again, adds some stories. This was also done by Van Twisk and Savitz Peters. And there's a whole reason, I'm not going to get into the reason why there are these, this actually has to do with some inter-Mennonite feuds and disagreements. They come out with these different martyr books, but they keep adding to it. And then finally, in 1631, let's see here, there we are, in 1631, we have the first of the martyrs books that uses the title Martyr's Mirror, Martyr's Spiegel, of the Wehrlose Christen, of the defenseless Christians. And that again is compiled and edited by Hans de Ries. He basically takes the 1526 one and pretty much and adds some more stories. And so this thing is continuing to grow, okay? And by this time, it's the size of a pretty good size of, about the size of a family Bible almost. So what we would call a family Bible. So there's all this, this thing grows from a thing that could fit in the hand of your hand that's going to have to put on a table to be able to read. You're not going to be very easily able to just lift it up and put it in your hands, okay? So one of the things that you have to keep in mind, and this is one of the things I wonder about, Tilman van Braal lived a very short life. This Martyrs book is a huge project. How did he do it? And one of the things I learned is, well, actually, a lot of it had already been done, okay? It grew from those small beginnings, those little pamphlets and so on, to this big Martyrs book, okay? But it's only dealing with starting in 1524, okay? That's the starting point, and it's going, and of course, as time goes on, they have more people to add to it, all right? So when Tilman van Braal began working on his Martyrs book, when he worked on his bloody theater of the baptism-minded and defenseless Christians, he already had this big Martyrs book, okay? But he was interested in doing something more, okay? Remember the beginning of when we looked at the beginning, the title was, he wanted to show the progression of this church of baptism-minded, those who baptized upon confession of faith, and those who were defenseless, down through the ages, from the time of Christ down to his own time, okay? And so what he did then was he compiled a new part to it. In fact, sometimes the part that deals with the Anabaptists and so on is referred to as the old book because it existed before. So he added new material, a whole new section at the very beginning that starts with Jesus and goes up to 1500, okay? And in that, he's trying to find believers who baptize upon confession of faith and who are defenseless. Now, sometimes he's overreaching. Okay, sometimes he's overreaching because some of the documentation is very sketchy, and of course he really picks up Hans de Ries in his foreword to his 1631 Martyr's Mirror first brought up the idea of the Waldensians being the precursors of the Anabaptists. And Tilman van Braal picks up on that also, okay? And so they're included in the first part of the Martyr's Mirror. So the first part is completely Tilman van Braal's work. Now there are confessions of faith, okay, and in the first part also, but the first part is pretty much his work. And he also writes a preface in which he explains why he compiled the Martyr's Mirror. Okay, remember we talked about the Het Af en de Heeren. It was compiled so that people who are facing the prospect of persecution will be encouraged to be faithful in the face of it. The 1660 Martyrs' Mirror. The Dutch Mennonites have become prosperous. They've become middle class. Some have become wealthy. They are no longer suffering persecution, though they are politically kind of second-class citizens, but they're not minding that too much, and so on. And they've done quite well. And they have split into umpteen different groups. There was some effort in 1632 to bring some of them together, where they adopted a common confession of faith, the Dordrecht Confession of Faith, and so on. But Tilman van Bra comes out with this new martyrs book with the purpose of, in a sense, trying to bring renewal back to the Doopgezinde, the baptism-minded in the Netherlands. He says in his preface, "These are sad times in which we live. Nay, truly there is more danger now than in the time of our fathers, who suffered death for the testimony of the Lord. Few will believe this, because the great majority look to that which is external and corporal. And in this respect it is now better, quieter, more comfortable. Few only look to what is internal and pertains to the soul. These times are certainly more dangerous. For then Satan came openly, through his servants, even at noonday, as a roaring lion, so that he could be known. And it is now and then was possible to hide from him. Besides, his chief design then was to destroy the body. But now he comes as in the night, or in the twilight, in a strange but yet pleasing form, and in a twofold way lies in wait to destroy the soul, partly to trample underfoot and annihilate entirely, if this were possible, the only saving Christian faith, partly destroy the true separated Christian life, which is the outgrowth of faith. Hence arrives the shameful and vast commerce which extends far beyond the sea into other." He's describing here the Dutch Mennonites, okay? And these are examples of 17th century Dutch Mennonite worldliness. Hence arise that shameful and vast commerce which extends far beyond the sea into other parts of the world, but which notwithstanding cannot satisfy those who love it, but on the contrary brings great danger that which has already been gotten may be lost, others defrauded, and they themselves both in soul and body stripped and robbed of their possessions. Numerous large, expensive, and ornamented houses, country seats, of splendid architecture, and provided with towers, parks, magnificent as a paradise, and other embellished pleasure gardens, which are seen on every hand, indicate this in no small degree. The wearing of clothes from foreign countries, whether of foreign materials, uncommon colors, or strange fashions, as obtained in the course of time according to the custom of the openly worldly minded, which are as changeable as the moon, and which custom is followed by many humble and seemingly plain people, confirms greatly what we have said before. How different is this from the life of a true Christian, who has forsaken himself and his lust? How great the step that is between their walk and that of the holy martyrs, who delivered not only their carnal desires, but also their bodies and their lives unto death for the Lord's sake. Okay? So, Tilman van Bra's purpose in compiling this martyr's book was to, in a sense, a warning, an instruction to his fellow Mennonites, reminding them of their martyrs' past, reminding them of their faithfulness, and pointing out to them the very real spiritual dangers that their time of affluence and wealth and materialism has brought to them. And so he's hoping that they would read the stories of these martyrs and renounce some of that, okay? That they would change their lives. Whether that happened or not, probably not so much. But that was his hope. That was his aspiration. Okay? And I would say that his preface really is quite timely, even for our day. So we have in the Martyr's Mirror, the 1660 edition, we have the first and the second books. The first part is of those who have suffered, been slain for 15 years, to wit, from Christ to the year 1500. The second part is the old book in the 16th and 17th centuries, that is to say, from the year 1500 until our last time. So he actually does bring it up to about 1660, the year it was published. Divided into 2 books. And about, yes, the Cathari are included. Okay, the Cathari are included as one of those. And one of the things you have to keep in mind is that, and actually more recent historians have really called into question some of the things that about the Cathari, about the Albigensians and so on, because what we know about them is what the Catholics told us. Okay, what the Catholics said. And they had a tendency to kind of typify everything, not to actually, they sort of had their categories and had a tendency to fit people in those kind of categories and so on. But, yes, that's very much almost Manichaeans. But again, that's a Roman Catholic way of kind of pigeonholing them. And they may have been, okay, they may have been. It's just that what we know about them is really pretty much what Roman Catholic writers and their enemies have said about them. And, you know, and I think about that, if you take what the Anabaptist enemies said about them, okay, much of which is not true, okay, and, you know, and again, it's very much where they kind of had their categories and they fit them into those categories. Van Bra, for this book, particularly for the first book, used 3 main sources. These aren't the only sources he used, but he used 3 main sources. One was Sebastian Frank's Chronicle, Jacob Marian, who compiled a book called Heilige Historia, Holy History of Baptism, came out in 1647. He really pushes the idea of the Waldensian connection. Okay? And then Peter Jan Twisk, who had helped compile 2 of those larger martyrs book. In 1617, 1620, came out with a chronicle of the world. Okay, it's a world chronicle. And it goes year by year with events in that year. And there are stories and accounts that Van Bra pulls from that. And another thing that he uses, he talks about until our last time. And so there are accounts about the suffering and persecution of the Swiss brethren in Zurich between the year 1635 and 1645. And there was an account written by them called the True Report. That's the title page of it right there. And of course, this is one of the Jan Lyken illustrations illustrating that final wave of persecution, which, by the way, successfully eliminated the Swiss brethren from Zurich. It was a very successful program by the Swiss Reformed Church and authorities there in Zurich. And they left. They literally left. And so Swiss Anabaptism came to an end in Zurich as a consequence. But Tilman Van Bra has accounts of that in his 1660 Martyr's Mirror. So again, you see that he's looking for whoever who are defenseless and who baptize upon confession of faith. Those are, in a sense, his people who he's identifying as his fellow believers. And then he did, even in the old book, he'd made some additions. And one of the things that's interesting, he, in some of the accounts, it seemed like, I would like to know a little bit more about these people. And of course, the interrogations, the sentencings and so on, the records of those were still in the various cities and towns where this had happened. And so he apparently would write to the city clerk of particularly Amsterdam and so on and ask, could you copy out the sentence of this particular person? And so he inserts some of those things there. Here's one, sentenced to death of Cecilia Geronimus in 1549. All right. And the other thing is really interesting. Now, all the martyr books, starting with the Het Offen de Heeren, had some of Jacob de Roer's letters in them. No, excuse me. Well, it was later editions of the Het Offen de Heeren. No, I'm sorry. It wasn't actually in the Het Offen de Heeren. It was in the 1615 one. They had some of his letters. But there was another book that that reported to be an account of the interrogation between Jacob de Rohr and Brother Cornelius, a Franciscan friar who was an inquisitor who questioned him and interrogated him. And if you go to your English Martyr's Mirrors, you're going to see this back and forth interrogation. In my mind, it's some of the more interesting reading in the Martyr's Mirror. But the source of it is actually a book that was printed by the Catholics. And so earlier martyr books were reluctant to use this. But Tilman van Braw includes this as part of it. And here's an illustration of Jan Lykens of the interrogation or the debate between Cornelius and Jacob de Rohr. And Cornelius, it's interesting, he shows himself to be a very crude, vulgar man. In the Martyr's Mirror, you're going to see some places, at least in earlier editions, where kind of hatch marks and so on. And that's where the Roman Catholic friar was cursing and using bad language. And Tilman van Braw was not going to reproduce that in his Martyr's Mirror. Okay? Then in Tilman van Braw dies, I think, I should have looked that up, I think it's 1664, 1666 he dies. As a very young man, not quite 40 years old, very prolific and so on. But in 1685, a second edition of the Martyr's Mirror came out. And here we have a slightly different title. And the term Martyr's Mirror is a little bit more to the top, whereas before it was farther down the bottom. The Bloody Theater, or the Martyr's Mirror of the baptism-minded or defenseless Christians. Okay? So this is an interesting production, because it was printed by a consortium of Dutch Reformed merchants. And they did it as a money-making venture. Okay, they thought, and what they did, I mean, there's a copy over, you can look at it. It's a beautiful book. It's a beautiful, lovely book. Exquisite printing and so on. And so the irony of this whole thing is they're printing this deluxe edition of the Martyr's Mirror to sell to Mennonites who can, first of all, afford the thing, okay, can afford the thing. And it's kind of a, how shall we say, it's kind of a display piece. You have this beautiful book there that you can sort of display with these lovely pictures. I mean, well, not lovely, some of them are rather grim, but they're well executed and so on. So there's a certain irony in the production of this second edition of the Martyr's Mirror. And it is, by the way, the last edition. The Dutch Martyr's Mirror was only printed twice, in 1660 and 1685. Now, later on in the 18th century, there are abridgments, small kind of abridgments of it, and so on. But I think the reason why it wasn't printed more often is it represents the fact that the Dutch Mennonites were increasingly assimilating. What Tilman van Braw hoped to accomplish by publishing the Martyr's Mirror was not accomplished, because the Dutch Mennonites just simply continued in their trajectory of becoming worldly and worldlier, more affluent and more assimilated. Okay? Jan Lykens was a Dutch Mennonite, or at least he started out as a Dutch Mennonite. Seems like toward the end of his life he was almost more of a spiritualist, or maybe a pietist, though that wouldn't be quite historically accurate. But he was an artist. He produced over 3,000 engravings. He did engravings for the Bible. There are editions of the Bible that have his engravings in them. He did all kinds of engravings for all kinds of different projects, and he was a well-known engraver. And so they got Tilman van Braw to produce 104 engravings. The first engraving that I have here illustrates the martyrdom of Polycarp. Okay? And so I want to look at some of these engravings kind of as looking at some of the stories behind the engravings. All right, I just want to look at some of these stories. Okay, first of all, a story from 1529 at Alsace in the Palatinate. In 1527, the elector of the Palatinate had gathered up a lot of believers, and he didn't quite know what to do with them. And so he wrote to the emperor, Emperor Charles V, and asked him, what should we do? Well, in 1527, at the Diet of Speyer, Charles V was pushing against the Lutherans, trying to, he had to, at the Diet of Worms, he had to kind of allow them some space. But in 1527, he wanted to basically eliminate Lutheranism. And so he was going to issue this edict making Lutheranism unlawful. Well, the German princes who had gone with Luther pushed against that. They protested that. That's actually where the term Protestant comes from. They protested against that. And so the emperor had to back off. But both the Protestant and the emperor and the Catholic princes were all agreed that they needed to eradicate Anabaptism from the midst. And so he issued an edict against that. And it's that edict which was served as the basis of all the executions and so on in the empire. And of course, the Netherlands was under the rule of Charles V. And so in 1529, 350 persons were executed there. In 1540, in Austria, a group of Hutterites, Philippites, some Swiss brethren had gathered together to talk about a possible uniting together or merging together, and they were apprehended by the authorities. They were tied up, and they were marched to the sea to be put on galleys, so that they would rule they would be galley slaves in the imperial navy. And this is a picture illustrating that. What's interesting about this is that their guards were really very lax. In fact, one later very important Hutterite leader escaped simply because his guards got drunk one night and he just walked away and went back to Moravia and so on. We have Maria and Ursula van Beckton burned at Deventer in 1544. These was two sisters-in-law. Ursula was married to Maria's brother Jan. These folks were actually noble. Most of the people who joined the Anabaptist movement were middling people, artisans and stuff like this. But these two women were actually noble women. And again, there's an account there in the Martyr's Mirror about their interrogation and so on. But Jan, her husband, Ursula's husband and Maria's brother, remained Roman Catholic. But they were executed in 1544. Now, the next person, John Neal, burnt in London in AD 1550. It's a very interesting story because this is the wrong person. It's not John Neal, it's Joan Neal, or Joan Boker, she's sometimes referred to. And she was an Englishwoman, again of noble family, who was converted to believer's baptism, and she was apprehended, and she was actually arrested at one time in 1542 and was held in prison for a number of years. But this is the period of time in which Henry is still, Thomas Cranmer is the Archbishop of Canterbury, but he really wants a Lutheran kind of reform. But he has to be very careful because Henry doesn't want to change any doctrine. Okay, but there are these pockets of Protestantism in England, and at the same time, there are Dutch immigrants who are living in England, and this has been a long-standing thing, who are involved in the weaving trade. And Anabaptism comes across the river, across the channel through those people. This Joan Boker, or Joan Neal, was arrested in 1549, and she actually was put in house arrest in the house of the chancellor, the chancellor, who was one of the main officials in the royal government, for almost over a year. and various bishops and so on visited her, all in the hopes that they could convert her, that they could give her up. But she wasn't going to have it. And so finally, on May 2nd of 1550, she was executed. Joan, or Johanna, and Johann are very similar in their spelling. And I think that whoever first read this account or had this account somehow or another got the names mixed up. And so it becomes John Neal and not Joan or Johanna. And of course, we have Augustine, a baker from Berwick. He's tied to a ladder and pushed in the fire in 1556. Andreas Langendal in Antwerp. His wife is having a baby. You can see that in the background there. The baby has just been born. When the authorities break into his house, he's reading his Bible. They arrest him. Somehow or another, they get the folks who are there in the back room get the wife and the baby away, okay, from the home. And he is beheaded. Okay. And then we have Pete Peters, burnt in Amsterdam in AD 1569. He's a boatman. He has a boat, and he ferries things across the bay there. And he uses his boat as, in a sense, a place for people to gather so he can preach to them, teach them, share the gospel with him. And that's what this illustration is. And then, of course, we have Dirk Williams, the famous story about Dirk Williams, who turned around to save his persecutor's life and was captured and burnt at the stake. A very gruesome death because the wind was blowing the wrong way. It was blowing the flames away from him so that it was a much longer execution. All right? Now, one of the things I mentioned was that the Martyr's Mirror was only printed twice in Dutch, 1660, 1685. And I think it would have been largely a forgotten book except for one thing. In 1745, the Mennonite leaders in Pennsylvania wrote a letter to the Dutch Mennonites saying, as they were looking at the scene, there was this contest between the British and the French for control of North America, and it looked like things were heating up to a war. And some of the leaders, Mennonite leaders here in Pennsylvania, said if they knew about the Martyr's Mirror, some of them could read Dutch, but most people could not read Dutch. And so they came up with this idea: if we could translate this martyr book into German so that our young people could read it, and they would be inspired as they're facing the possibility of demands for military service, of getting involved in a war and so on, that they would be inspired to remain faithful to the defenseless faith of the martyrs. And so they write to the Dutch Mennonites and ask them, because the Dutch Mennonites have plenty of money, all right, and ask them, would you have somebody pay to have somebody translate this and print it? They actually asked them for, I think, around 1,000 copies of it, or some 1,500 copies of it. Well, they it took the Dutch Mennonites 3 years to send a reply, and they basically said, no, not going to do it. It's too expensive, too big of a task, and so on. And he said, well, maybe what you could do is that you probably have some people there that can translate some stories from Dutch, to have those translated, and then pass them around to young people, have them copy it out, those stories out, and they could just kind of pass them around, and that would probably work, and so on. Well, in the meantime, the Pennsylvania Mennonite leaders, I think, realized that the Dutch were not going to come through, and so they launched out on their own. And at the Seventh Day, there was a group of Seventh-day German Baptists in Ephrata. One of their leaders was a man by the name of Peter Miller. He was a graduate of the University of Heidelberg. He was multilingual, and he translated. The Mennonites made an arrangement with the Ephrata cloisters to have the book translated from the Dutch into the German, not promising that they would buy any copies. Okay, not making any promises. Okay, but of course, the Seventh-day German Baptists also were defenseless, and they also baptized upon they also practiced believers' baptism. And so, in some sense, this book was also kind of their book too, all right? And as you can see, but the difference, one of the differences between them and the Mennonites is how they baptized. And in some copies of the Martyr's Mirror, there's a frontispiece, a picture, an engraving of Jesus being baptized the German Baptist way, okay, 3 times face forward, all right? That's sort of an interesting thing. And that's a copy of the 2 title pages. The first title page of the old part, and then the second, of the first part, and then the second part. It took them 2 years to print it. You'll look there, and you'll see the first title page has the date 1748. The second title page has the date 1749. So this is a big task. In fact, it's the biggest book printed in colonial America. All right? And when the Mennonite leaders, as the thing came off the press, they were reading through the pages and so on, and they said, they declared it to be a good translation, they recommended it to their people, and they bought it. Now, one of the things that's interesting is they added a few things. While this was being printed, some Mennonite farmer brought to them a list of martyrs or persons who had been in prison in Bern through the years. Somebody had some Swiss Brethren person had gone through the records and made a list of the persons who'd been in prison and persecuted for their faith. And so they didn't have room for it. They already were printing it. And so what they did is they put it in the margins. So you'll see those columns there on the sides and so on. That's a list of persons who were imprisoned in Bern. And then there's this interesting story about Hans Hollebacher. And this is in the Ostbund. This is an Ostbund hymn. He was martyred in 1571. And it's a rather amazing story if you read it. He predicts at the time of his execution, that when they cut off his head, that it would fall into his hat and he would laugh. Okay? Do you ever hear that story before? Okay? So they added that to the Martyr's Mirror. So I want to end with the translation that we use now, The Bloody Theater or the Martyr's Mirror, first printed in 1886 by the Mennonite Publishing Company at the John F. Funk, who was the editor of the Mennonite Publishing Company. He's kind of the engine behind this. But he got a immigrant by the name of Joseph Sohm, who could translate from Dutch into English, and he translated this thing. And it's the translation we still use. And I want to end with what John Funk says is his purpose for why he felt it was necessary to have an English translation. As the English language, year by year, becomes more prevalent among our Mennonite people, the necessity of presenting to them in that language the doctrines, teaching, and practices, as well as the story of the sufferings, the faithful endurance, and the final triumphal deaths of those of like faith with us who lived in the earlier ages of Christianity, become apparent to every reflecting mind. These doctrines, teaching, and practices, together with the examples of faithful devotion to Christ and His Word, and unfaltering endurance under the severest persecution, are powerful incentives to Christians today to inspire many sincere souls to live a more consecrated life, to practice greater self-denial, to live more separate from the world, and show greater zeal in the work of the Lord and the salvation of souls. And they are especially precious to us as Mennonites because through these people, it pleased God to hand down to us the living exemplification of the peculiar tenets and doctrines which we hold and practice at the present day. It is the duty of the church to maintain and teach the pure gospel of Jesus Christ, to transmit the same to coming generation. And as we contemplate these facts, what a glorious treasure of pure Christian devotion shines forth in the pages of the story of the martyrs. And how much this grand record of their suffering has done and may yet do to perpetuate the pure doctrines of the gospel, eternity alone will reveal. And I think that is still a good purpose And if one reads the Martyr's Mirror, that still can function in that way. Okay, any questions? Well, that's the question, isn't it, Fred? Because that was a concern of Tilman van Bra when he compiled the Martyr's Mirror. He saw self-denial evaporating as Mennonites became worldly and more less separated from the world, and so on. I think we're living in a day when we see all of our plain groups struggling with separation from the world across the board. Okay, across the board. Everybody seems to be confronting this. Can reading the Martyr's Mirror, at least looking at some of the stories and so on, I think if we take the lessons to heart, if we can see how they said no to, in many cases, for example, Joan Nail or Joan Blocker, all she had to do was to renounce it, because Cranmer really wanted to let her go. But and in fact, in April of 1549, she was arrested, and she was interrogated along with a number of other believers, and she was the only one who didn't recant. And they worked on her for a year to try to get her to recant, and she refused to do so. And so they finally executed her. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you for your attention. And that brings to close this series of lessons.